So, good evening. My name is Larry Thiel. I'm the director of the Global Affairs Center here at the Concordia at Shoreline College, and we're here tonight to talk about the use of biotechnology, sometimes referred to as genetic engineering in agriculture. Genetic manipulation of plants through crossbreeding has been done for a long, long time, thousands of years. It's resulted in domesticated corn and wheat and hundreds of varieties of apples, among other things. The supply of food has kept up with population growth. It was about 1 billion. The world population growth was about 1 billion at the start of the 20th century, and it's up to around 7 billion now, a little over that now. Through new forms of breeding, we've produced more food. Some argue that these new forms of breeding crops, which we'll be talking about today, involving the manipulations in a laboratory, represent a fundamental shift from traditional breeding methods and should be embraced, if at all, with great caution. Thus, the question is direct manipulation of something called DNA, which we'll talk about more, in crop genes, the next great thing in crop improvement and food development to meet future challenges of feeding the world? Or is it a risky endeavor that could lead to severe health, social, and environmental problems? What have we learned about the benefits and challenges of using this new technology since the Flavor Saver tomato was introduced in the 1990s? I bet some of you remember the Flavor Saver tomato. Will the benefits of agriculture technology be shared by all countries and regions of the world? Or will these benefits mainly benefit the developed countries but do little to improve life in the poorest regions of the world? Joining us to discuss these and other questions are three individuals with significant knowledge and experience. Let me just introduce them briefly. We have Dr. Toby Bradshaw in the center, chairperson of the biology department at the University of Washington, where he specializes in molecular genetics. If I have that right. His research and publishing accomplishments are many, but he's perhaps best known for the firebombing of his laboratory by environmental activists about 15 years ago. Dr. Natalie Dinicola, am I pronouncing that correctly? Sitting across? Dinicola, okay. Vice President of Sustainable Ag Partnerships at Monsanto Company. She leads efforts to embed sustainability principles throughout the company. She also leads the development of public-private partnerships, and we'll be talking about those things. Then immediately to my left here is Dr. Christina Owen, Program Officer in the Ag Development Group at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She develops and manages research and development grants with a focus on leveraging discovery science and innovation for smallholders in developing countries. So here's how we're going to proceed. I've invited each of our guests to make a short presentation, kind of the remarks that provide some important background to our discussion. After they've all spoken a little bit for a few minutes, I'd like to open it up immediately to questions from the audience to see what questions you have. When we open it up for questions, please there'll be a cordless mic that will be moving around the room, and please use the cordless microphone just so that everybody in the room can hear you clearly. And please keep your questions short and relevant. On that last point, let me say a few words about the scope and intention of this discussion. This is not a debate about the merits and the motives behind using biotechnology or not. The extent of use of the technology is staggering to date. Something like 80% of cotton produced in the world, 75% of the soybeans, and 30% of the corn, more than 25% of the canola oil comes from seeds that have been genetically engineered. The question that I hope we address is, what are the benefits and concerns to us and to the rest of the world regarding the use of these technologies? I would like to focus on that question rather than should these technologies be used or not. So let's get started. We're going to begin with Dr. Bradshaw, who will provide some of the scientific fundamentals of the subject. Next, Dr. Dinicola will talk about the commercial side of agriculture biotechnology, and in particular, Monsanto's experience. Then Dr. Owen will speak to the role of biotechnology in agricultural development in developing countries. And she'll be talking about some of the initiatives of the Gates Foundation in this regard. So, Toby, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Larry. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you here. I just want to start with a few definitions. It's probably the professor in me that makes me do this. But part of the issues of surrounding genetic engineering in agriculture have to do with misunderstandings about what the technology really is. So you often hear the term, we heard it last year when Initiative 522, the labeling of genetically engineered foods, was being discussed and debated and eventually voted on. We keep hearing the term of genetically modified organism when it relates to genetically engineered plants. So I want to make it clear right from the beginning that there's a difference between genetic modification and genetic engineering. Genetic modification is a change to the genes, the DNA of any organism by any means. And we've been genetically modifying plants for the last 10,000 years or so since the dawn of agriculture in the Near East. But genetic engineering is a subset of genetic modification techniques. Genetic engineering is the deliberate introduction of DNA from one organism into another by some asexual process. So we've moved genes around between plants for, as Larry mentioned at the outset, for the last 10 millennia by crossbreeding, by hybridization, by pollinating one species with the pollen from another species. So mixing genes from different species is something we have a lot of experience with, 10,000 years of experience. But genetic engineering is a much newer technology developed in about the 1980s in a few labs around the world, developing various means of introducing DNA into plant cells by some means other than pollination, by some asexual means. It could be introduced with a bacterium that has the ability to introduce DNA into plants. It could be shot in with a ballistic cannon, little gold particles covered with DNA. It could be micro-injected with a needle. There are lots of ways to get DNA inside a plant cell, and plants have the ability, once the DNA is inside their cell, to incorporate that. So if that process is done deliberately, that introduction of DNA by this asexual process is done deliberately, that's genetic engineering. So plants that have been genetically engineered are properly described as genetically engineered plants or genetically engineered organisms or transgenic plants, but not just as genetically modified organisms. So an analogy is that, for example, a Chihuahua is a genetically modified wolf, but it's not genetically engineered. It was modified by selection of pre-existing mutations that arise spontaneously to produce something that looks like a Chihuahua from something that looked like a wolf at one time. And a lot of essentially all of our domesticated crops are analogous to that. Many of our crops that we use as staple foods don't exist in wild form anywhere in the world, and at least anything that you would recognize as a wild relative. They're as completely domesticated as a Chihuahua is. And they're genetically modified, and then they may or may not be genetically engineered. A relatively small subset of crops so far has been genetically engineered. So if we can keep the terminology straight, it will help us compare the risks and benefits of genetic engineering to the same risks and benefits that are produced by other forms of genetic modification, including all of the different modifications that we've done over the past 10,000 years until genetic engineering was first employed by people in the 1980s or so.
Okay.
Okay. Well, good evening. Thank you, everybody, for the chance to be here. I'm really happy to be here with you.
You have to move a little closer, push that toward you.
I am surprised. I thought I did loud enough. Can you hear me better now? Is this okay? Okay. So I'm an environmental toxicologist by training from many, many years ago, and I got into that field because I was really interested in bird habitat preservation in particular. And it led me to understand a lot about agriculture and the environment. And so that's one of my big passion areas, I would say. And I'm a mom. I have a 4-year-old son and a 9-year-old son. And nothing's more important to me than their health and safety. That is number one. I've worked with Monsanto now for 17 years. And as Larry mentioned, I've been leading sustainability now for some time. And that has been a really wonderful experience because it's helped me to really understand, both from that environmental interest I had as well as a mother, what are some of the biggest global challenges that we're facing as a society and a planet. And Larry touched on it a little bit, that we have a growing population. One statistic I heard from the United Nations that really blew my mind was that we're actually going to have to grow more food in the next 36 years than we have in the last 10,000 years accumulated. So a huge, huge challenge for mankind to do that. Because, and even right now, we have 1 billion people around the world who are food insecure, who don't have enough food. And a lot of them are children. We have a lot of folks impoverished around the world, and 70% of those people are farmers. And so it really, I'd say, led me to feel that we as a company have an opportunity, and I would say a responsibility, to do what we can to try to contribute solutions to these kind of global challenges, because we have a big challenge ahead of us of producing enough food and addressing a lot of the other challenges that cause hunger around the world. But at the same time, we have to do that with a changing climate. We have to do that with limited amounts of water and limited amounts of land, because the more that agriculture is growing, it encroaches on things like rainforests and wetlands and other things that we'd rather not be converting to agriculture. And so it really helped me understand what that opportunity and responsibility is. So Monsanto is a company that is 100% focused only on agriculture. Our customers are essentially farmers, which is only about 2% of the population here, but lots and lots, millions of farmers all around the world. And we're basically a very science-based company. We try to apply science like you see in medicine, like you see in communications. We try to apply that to agriculture, to figure out how can we improve agriculture, make it better, help us be able to produce food more efficiently while taking judicious care of our natural resources. And we really focus on 4 different research platforms to do that. One of them is traditional type breeding, which has actually been advanced because as we're learning more about the DNA, as Toby mentioned, we're able to make smarter combinations of which plants to combine, and it allows us to make improvements faster. And through that breeding, we're really trying to optimize the ability of a plant to produce harvest. What's its, how much can it actually produce? A second research engine we use is biotechnology, some call it, or I would say you're calling it genetic engineering, this concept, which I agree with you. I'm trying to apply to all this, but that concept of genetic engineering, where we're selecting certain genes and putting them into the plant to provide a certain characteristic. And in that case, we've focused largely on trying to insert genes that are going to protect the plant from that yield potential it got through breeding. Things like insects, things like weeds, things like drought that will keep the plant from actually experiencing its full potential. And then we have 2 other platforms that we've started more recently. One of them is called precision agriculture, where we're really trying to, so we do these things to try to make a better seed, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. The farmer really needs to know how to plant it best, where to plant it best, which varieties work best, how deep it should be planted. And we're now at a point where we're able to even take a lot of satellite information around weather and try to predict for a farmer what parts of his field have what level of moisture for that different soil type, and really help them make very precise decisions that are going to help them optimize the planting on that farm and use their resources more efficiently. And then the last area is an area of biologicals, where we're trying to use various natural compounds to help protect plants. And in some cases, there's a whole area called microbials, amazing amount of microbes around the roots of a plant, and we're really just trying to starting to understand how those microbes can really help a plant absorb water better, avoid diseases better. So those are the 4 different kind of research platforms. We have about half of our business in the United States, half of it in different parts of the world. And a couple things I just mentioned, and our crops that we work on are fruits and vegetables, as well as corn, soybeans, cotton, and canola. And we try to reach farmers of all different sizes. So farmers with big pieces of land, like you'll see here in the United States, and what we call smallholder farmers that Christina probably spends a lot of time with in some of the other parts of the world, where they they'll have a plot that's not too much bigger than a room like this that they're trying to feed themselves on. And it's interesting. I think most people think that Monsanto customers are pretty much all these larger landholding farmers, but in reality, there's about 18 million farmers around the world using crops produced through genetic engineering by us and other companies. And about 90% of those farmers are actually smallholder farmers around the world. And that's where I spend a fair bit of my time through the kind of public-private partnerships with organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, environmental organizations, and really trying to help these farmers, many of whom are actually women in other parts of the world, grow enough food for themselves, improve their income, and with that be able to improve their lives. And so I want to ask a question. How many folks here have heard of Monsanto before? And how many people here have heard good things about Monsanto? Okay, it's good to see a couple hands at least. Our company, I think does pretty cool stuff that's really important. We have lots of scientists in our company, but we have not been very good communicators. And we haven't been, I think, as transparent as we need to be in answering questions that people have and not talking only about the science and really trying to help people get the information that they're seeking about what our products are and how they work. And so we've been trying to do a couple things in the last 18 months to improve that. And one of them is a website called discover.monsanto.com, where you can essentially write in any question you have, and we will try to get you an answer within 48 hours. And we will try to give you references to other places where you can get more information if you wanted to. There's another one called gmoanswers.com, where not Monsanto employees, but other people, academics, government scientists, many others, will answer questions that you have. And those people are doing it free of charge, because many of these scientists and universities and the government who review the safety of a lot of these products feel very strongly that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and they want to be part of trying to help people get the answers they're looking for. And so I wanted to throw those two resources out there, and thank you for the chance to be here, because this is one of our opportunities to try to answer questions that you have.
Thank you. Christina?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you all here. I'm a a program officer in the Agricultural Development Division of the Gates Foundation, and it's actually exciting to be here because I actually grew up just in Marysville, just north of here, so I consider myself a local. But the Gates Foundation was funded about 15 years ago by Bill and Melinda Gates and their friend Warren Buffett. And it's really founded on two basic principles. One is that all lives have equal value, and that every person, no matter where they are born, deserves the chance to live a healthy and productive life. And I think those are two really powerful kind of principles that guide our missions. So in the Agricultural Development Division, our goal is to help smallholder farmers increase their productivity so that they can lift themselves out of poverty. As Natalie was saying, many of the world's farmers in low-income countries are women. They have very small plots of land. They generally farm not with big tractors or mechanization, but with hand tools. It's very labor intensive, and they face a number of constraints. One of the big examples that comes to my mind is always with cassava, which is not a crop that we see grown here very often, but we know it as tapioca. So if you've eaten tapioca pudding, you've had cassava. And there's lots of diseases, very severe diseases that affect cassava. One in particular is cassava brown streak disease, and I like to use this as an example because I think it particularly highlights the kind of work that we try to do. So cassava brown streak disease, cassava grows up, it looks like a little tree, like a little shrub, and the tubers are quite long, and they're white on the inside mostly, and it's a starchy kind of food. You can get, it's also called yucca, and you can get it fried too. But cassava brown streak disease, it's a viral disease that causes the tubers to have really dark brown, necrotic, bad spots in it. It makes them hard. unusable to farmers. But the symptoms of this viral disease often don't show themselves very apparently in the leaves. So it's usually when farmers are going to harvest that they find out that their cassava is infected with a disease like cassava brown streak disease. So, I've met farmers in Tanzania whose crops suffer from this disease and who often don't even know that their plants have it until they're in the field with a virologist or a local scientist, or even just when they go to harvest and all of a sudden their harvest is completely devastated. And because cassava is a food security crop, so people usually grow it as a backup to their maize or other crops, and they usually rely on it when times are particularly tough. When their cassava is bad, it really is. It's devastating to the family, and they really are looking at starvation. So it's those farmers that are, growing crops like cassava that may suffer from diseases like brown streak disease that we try to help, and we do that in a number of different ways. So we the foundation makes investments in research and development, which is the area that I work in, to look for technological solutions, scientific solutions, breeding solutions to combat diseases like cassava brown streak disease and a variety of others. We also try to support work in extension and knowledge. So like Natalie was talking about, when's the best time to plant? How can we help farmers be smarter about how they're planting, where they're planting, when they're planting, how to care for those plants to maximize their yield. And then we also help try to connect those farmers to markets so that when they can have good harvests, that they have a place to go with it, that they can sell it. And the ultimate goal really is to have food in tummies, money in pockets, and help support those smallholder farmers so that they can, again, raise their productivity and lift themselves out of poverty. So we do invest in a lot of different approaches to achieving that goal. And I think on the research and development side, we support basic breeding. We support, is the kind of breeding that Toby was talking about, just crossing two plants, trying to see if we can, you can manipulate things that way and try to breed in the traits that you'd like to see. And then a very small percentage of our portfolio, I'd say less than 5% of what we invest in on the agricultural team is in biotechnology solutions, so genetically engineered solutions. And we see that as one of many tools to try to solve some of these really serious issues that these farmers face in developing countries. So that's kind of our,
Other questions that any of you have? All right. Just a moment. Forgot about the microphone, didn't I? See?
How will the trade pacts affect Monsanto's efforts? There are limitations sometimes in those that there are challenges from the other countries that we develop trade agreements with on the importation of foodstuffs, specifically genetically modified things, and oversight by U.S. agencies on foods sometimes aren't allowed on foods coming in from other countries. Does Monsanto have anything to do in that area?
Well, trade agreements are extremely complex, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in that at all. But what I can share is that I think it's to your question, is that one of the things we really try to focus on is trying to increase food production in different parts of the world. The United States is certainly a breadbasket for the world. And so I think we export about 2/3 of our corn and about 1/3 of our soybeans is what I think I remember right. And so when we develop a product using genetic engineering, it goes through a very rigorous regulatory review process in the United States that includes the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Food and Drug Administration. They all have a part to play in that review. And other countries as well have their own regulatory systems where they have to review either crops that are being planted in their country or crops that they're importing into their country. And we believe that we will only import to places, to countries that have a regulatory system in place that's based on science, and that we have these reviews done and the import approvals in. And so there's quite a few countries, most countries that have actually approved biotech products. There is the process of getting a review done for each product that you develop, and that takes a lot of time, and it can get complicated with politics and a lot of other things that happen. But we try to work with the whole industry, the whole grain industry, with different governments to try to provide the information that they need to facilitate those import approvals. But that is one of the challenges, I think, more and more, and the U.S. government, I think, is pretty interested in ensuring that there's science-based processes around the world where farmers here in the United States are able to move their grain.
What is pivotally, what is the different condition between today and agricultural revolution in 18th century, considering bioengineering?
Agricultural revolution in which century?
From 18th century to 19th century.
I would say there wasn't an agricultural revolution between the 18th and 19th centuries. The real progress in agriculture has really been made in the 20th century. Because until the principles of genetics were elucidated, starting about 1900 when Mendel's laws were rediscovered, the only technique that farmers had to breed new varieties of plants was to cross two plants that they liked and hope that the offspring looked like the parents. And maize yields, corn yields had been stable for 7,000 years before 1900. So there was no revolution prior to a scientific understanding of genetics. But in the early part of the 20th century, when Mendel's laws were rediscovered, there was a flurry of activity using plants to understand basic genetic principles. And as a spin-off of this basic research, it was discovered, for example, that crossing two inbred varieties of corn produced a hybrid corn that was much higher yielding and much easier to harvest because everything ripened uniformly than the previous varieties that had been available. And hybrid maize was one of the most rapidly adopted technologies in agricultural history. The first hybrid maizes were produced on purpose in about the time of World War I, so the middle 19-teens, and by the early 1940s, virtually all of the maize grown in the United States was hybrid maize. And if you look at the yield of maize over time, it was flat for millennia, and then about the early part of the 1900s, it started to go up, and yields have increased phenomenally over the past century. So the question really is, what is the upper limit for yield? I mean, we don't believe it's infinitely high, and what tools are we going to use to continue to increase yield? Because as Natalie mentioned, the penalty for not increasing yield is either more people go hungry or more land gets plowed up. In the United States, we've already converted a third of our surface area, ice-free surface area, to agriculture. Right? There's no more tall grass prairie in the middle of the United States. It's all plowed up to grow corn and soybeans. So agriculture itself, prior to any of this technology, had dramatic impacts on the environment worldwide. And if we're going to produce more food for the 10 billion people that are going to be here by the end of the century, you have to consider what tools do you want to have on the table. Personally, I would like to have all of the tools on the table because I see that as an enormous challenge. And you can say that we produce enough food to feed everyone today, and that's accurate. And you can say that it's a food distribution problem or a poverty problem. That's accurate too. But we don't produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. We better figure that out, in the next 80 years or so. Right, so that was in 2005, and you can Google this, find it on YouTube. If you're having trouble getting to sleep at night, I highly recommend it.
Can you paraphrase this question? Apparently the microphone wasn't picking it up.
Sure. The question is, since the lecture that I gave in 2005, and the outcome of that, or the take home from that, was characterized as genetic engineering is basically just another tool, not really different from the kind of breeding that we've been doing for the last 10,000 years. Have my views changed? So actually in 2005, I hope I didn't imply that genetic engineering is exactly like all of the other breeding tools that we use. There are some significant differences between genetic engineering and all of the other previously available tools, including some that most people don't know about. You mentioned radiation mutagenesis, for example. Most people don't realize that since World War II, hundreds and hundreds of crop varieties have been developed by irradiating seeds with fast neutrons or X-rays or alpha particles in order to produce mutations, variation that farmers can use, that breeders can use to select from new varieties. That was a common technique, and I think most people would wonder how safe that is, because no testing, of course, is required for plants that are produced by radiation breeding. But I do think that genetic engineering is fundamentally different in some ways. The most obvious way that it's different is it's possible to bring DNA from literally any organism into the genome of a plant. Any organism, a virus, a bacterium, a fungus, another plant, an animal, anything. So there are potential risks there, obviously. The fact that something's genetically engineered, though, doesn't capture the risk. Without knowing what was genetically engineered into the plant, it's really impossible to assess risk. And Natalie mentioned that in their regulatory process, each of the products that they make has to be separately put through the regulatory process. That's because regulators don't care that it was genetically engineered per se. They want to know what are the characteristics of the crop with the specific genes that were put into it. So I do believe that genetic engineering can produce novel combinations of traits that aren't available by any other means, and that's both its biggest risk and also its biggest potential benefit. And the only way that we can produce the benefit and minimize the risks is to have a deep understanding of the genes that we're introducing and the properties of the plant after the gene's been introduced, and that's more or less what the science that drives the development of the crops in the regulatory process that governs their release. That's what those processes are designed to do. So I'm perfectly comfortable with the genetically engineered crops that are available commercially worldwide now. But can you imagine a genetic engineering exercise that produce something dangerous? I can easily imagine that. For example, and I gave these examples in that 2005 lecture, I think engineering pharmaceutically active proteins into common food crops is a mistake, because we have very poor means of segregating crops after production, and I wouldn't want pharmacologically active proteins that could leak into the ordinary food supply. I think engineering common allergens into staple food crops is just a bad idea. There are some reasons that you might come up with for doing such a thing in order to improve nutritional quality, for example, which there is an example of that. But it's inherently a risky exercise. So yeah, there are things that I would recommend not doing by genetic engineering, but you can't. The technology itself isn't good or bad in the same way that electricity isn't good or bad. I mean, electricity it's great if it works the lights, and it's bad if you stick your finger in the socket. I mean, it's just a technology. How it's used depends entirely on the details, and I think that's what most people aren't familiar with. Let me just go off on one minor tangent. This was my issue with the labeling initiative last year that was in Washington. The label was meant to say whether the plant was genetically engineered or not without telling you what was genetically engineered into it. I mean, as a scientist, knowing that something's genetically engineered, that's not useful to me. I need to know what's in it. And so I think that from the scientific side, we tend to focus on the qualities of the product and not the process by which it was made. The process by which something's made is essentially irrelevant. What are the properties of the product? There are many people, of course, who believe that the process is equally important or maybe more important than the product, but I don't think you'll find many scientists who feel that way. The example would be, for example, the organic label on food. It tells you how the food was made, but it tells you nothing about what's in it or on it. That's just not useful from my point of view. So no, I haven't really changed my opinion since 2005.
Any other questions out there?
Is there a danger of developing crops that are so monoclonal, that disease sneaking in, if these crops are shipped all over the world and farmers all over the world are growing the same crop, that a disease could hit, and that would be a real disaster. That's question one. The other question I have is, we're losing.
You have 2 questions?
I'll leave it at we're losing topsoil. I mean, everybody does, and water as well. In India, I think it was last year, they had so many water pumps pumping well water that they lost power to 600 million Indians for a while. So I assume the water will probably run out before the topsoil does, but what's being done about those issues?
That's a big one.
So your first one, actually a big part of our breeding program is to try to introduce more genetic diversity into the different crops, whatever they are, and with a particular focus on disease tolerance, disease resistance, to your point. And we also, I mean, here in the United States, farmers can grow corn, soybeans, cotton, some other crops. They have that opportunity based on the conditions and the market demand. And we do encourage crop rotation and that they're using cover crops. But that's something we think a lot about, is how do we build that resilience into the different kinds of seed types that are out there for the farmer. Your question on topsoil, I love that you brought up soil. It was just the Year of Soil was launched not too long ago, and I think most people probably don't know a lot about how precious our topsoil really is. For us, this has been actually a major focus. We have, I would say, the combination of seed, but also those precision agriculture methods I mentioned to you. We're really trying to help farmers understand what are the different soil types they have, and what's the best kind of practices that they can be using for those situations. And one of the probably the best opportunities with topsoil, protecting topsoil, that's enabled through genetic engineering is conservation tillage. So, you know, most folks see that farmers have, here in the United States, have big pieces of equipment. They take their tractor out there, they run up and down the field and they plow up the soil so that they can control weeds. And one of the advantages of genetic engineering is that we've been able to insert a gene from a bacterium and put it into the actual plant. And it's the same bacterium that's actually sprayed in organic farming. We've put it into the plant so the plant expresses it. And one of the benefits, oh, I'm confusing insects and herbicides there. Sorry about that. So this one, I'm so sorry. In this case, we took a gene and we basically made the plant able to resist a herbicide so that we can control the weeds really effectively around the plant itself. And one of the benefits of that is it's allowed farmers to not have to do tillage of the soil. And that's drastically reduced the amount of erosion and runoff that we see from those farmers. There's actually a really neat group called Field to Market that includes, I think it's about 50 organizations now. It's got environmental organizations, farmer organizations, government, academia, all different folks who are really interested in understanding the sustainability of agriculture. And they've just tried to look at what's the footprint of growing a bushel of corn in the United States and what's happened over the last 30 years. And what they've basically found is that while we have improvement to go, it's moving in a good direction. Our yields of corn have increased about 60%. At the same time, we're using about a third of the amount of land, about a third of the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted, because when you churn up that soil, you release a lot of greenhouse gases, about half the amount of water, and soil loss is down about 67%, so about 2/3. Now that's using a lot of different practices, but we know that genetic engineering is quite a bit of the corn and soybean out there in the United States. So there's more to be done, but I do think we're moving in a good direction.
Okay. I think in terms of climate change too, I mean, water is a huge issue for farmers in low-income countries, especially in Africa. And I think that, you know, we've tried to invest in various ways to improve crop plants so that they can withstand drought. Some of our biggest investments are in maize. We have a partnership that does involve Monsanto actually that called the Water Efficient Maize for Africa project that is specifically designed to develop maize that for African farmers that we can withstand drought, because I think the data that we've seen suggests that drought is going to be one of the biggest factors in climate change. That's not going to change. It's a problem now. It's going to get worse, and for farmers, it's a real issue. So, this project is, I think, a really great example of a public-private partnership that we've been able to develop or facilitate, where a public sector research group is basically partnering with Monsanto and taking their technology for free, putting it into African corn varieties and offering that technology for free for poor farmers in Africa. And for us, that's a huge win. I think too, another point that I'd like to make on the issue of genetic diversity is that in all of our breeding programs, all of the plants that are bred for Africa are exactly that. They're bred for Africa. So these traits that are really helpful, really useful, drought resistance, salt tolerance or submergence tolerance are developed and bred into local varieties that the farmers in those places want to grow, that they prefer to grow. So that farmers in Bangladesh are not having to grow rice that was developed for Japan, but they still have a submergence tolerance trait in their own variety that they really like to grow, and they can grow their Swarna, submergence tolerance rice in Bangladesh where they live. It's developed for them, and I would say that the vast majority, if not all, of our breeding projects that we support, whether it's through genetic engineering or through traditional, standard breeding techniques, is designed to be adapted into local varieties that match the needs of the local farmers.
And can I just build on one point that, so in this particular project too, in that project, we actually combined breeding with genetic engineering. That was the idea. And to get to, and get to that point around diversity. So there's a research institution, a public sector research institution in Africa called CIMMYT that has been breeding for African farmers with African varieties for a really long time, just like Christina said. And one of the things when we partnered with them, one of our hopes was Monsanto has all these different corn varieties in different parts of the world. And some of those are going to have more drought tolerance than what we might have in Africa today. And so we thought, what will happen if we combine those? Maybe we're going to find some things that when they come together, they're going to be even more drought tolerant and be even better for helping these farmers adapt to climate change. So Monsanto donated about 700 breeding lines from different parts of the world, and we combined them with those CIMMYT lines. And to Christina's point, African scientists in African soil have been refining those and really making sure they're fitting for local conditions. And we are finding that really significant increase that we were hoping to see. And so it's likely that these varieties that are coming out are going to be more drought tolerant than anything that's available today. And then we have a drought tolerant genetically engineered trait and an insect protection trait that were also donated that will further help protect those farmers. And one of the things that I think is important for a place like Africa too right now is the project donated these technologies, these varieties that were developed for every seed company in Africa. The idea being that we want farmers to have lots of choices. My vision for smallholder women farmers in Africa is that companies like mine are competing hard and working hard to earn their business, and they have lots of different choices out there. But right now, the seed industry is not very well developed, and farmers don't really have very many options to even get the hybrid seeds that Toby was mentioning. And so part of the vision for this project is that we're helping the farmers, but we're also helping the whole seed industry, a lot of local seed companies in Africa, so that we're creating jobs and providing that longer term opportunity for the farmers.
quick question. One question I have for you. In fact, I have two questions. One is, with the exception of scientists like yourself, when you speak or talk to the general public, oftentimes it is a negative sentiment that they have toward genetically modified products or genetically engineered products. First of all, why is that's the case? And then this.
A little louder, please.
Sure. When you ask the general public about genetic engineering or genetically modified products, with the exception of scientists like yourself, the response you get is often negative. Why is that is the case? Why is it that, what is it that people are afraid of? And the second question that I have is, with reduction in yield, one of the fears that I have, I'll be honest, is what I have read about and what I have heard about is that there seems to be a reduction in yield when there is genetically modified product. If that is true, maybe you might be able to clarify the solutions for it. And then the fear of eventually private companies trademarking some of these products in such a way that people have to always rely on obtaining their products from private entities. Those are the two fears that I have heard as well.
You had two questions. Actually, the first one was a really good one. He was basically, tell me if I'm wrong, but you basically, I had the same question now. You know, why is it so controversial? That was your kind of your first question. And in the scientific community, there seems to be a level of comfort, but in the general public, there's not a level of comfort. And so the question is, why is it so controversial? Biotech research and biotech products.
Well, I guess I would ask the audience. I mean, what are you concerned about, or what have you heard people being concerned about genetically engineered food? There was a lot of talk about this last year.
Monsanto suing farmers, putting the seed business into the hands of one company that could potentially control the world's food.
Okay, so corporate control of food. Okay, what are other issues? That's actually not the most. I've given surveys to my classes for, I don't know, the last 15 years. So I have a pretty clear idea of what people are worried about, at least what my students are worried about. And that always comes up, but it's never the top one or two. Nobody's heard of any other issues?
The issue of, one of the things one typically hears, whether it's true or not, is that many of the crops being developed by companies like Monsanto or Dow or so forth are involved with using herbicides that makes the farmers very, very dependent upon the use of herbicides. And in fact, many of the older agricultural practices of rotation and so forth to keep weeds at bay have resulted in super weeds. And there's also a general concern, I think I've heard expressed, of more not only some of the early generation of herbicides being bred, herbicide tolerance being bred into plants, but now even additional herbicides like 2,4-D tolerance being bred into plants and so forth, and wondering where all that's going to lead. I mean, the heavy use of herbicides doesn't strike me as being something that's particularly desirable, but yet it seems to be happening in more and more of the genetically engineered crops, at least for crops grown in the first world. Perhaps not those that are being used in the third world. Maybe our representative from the Gates Foundation could speak to that.
Okay, so corporate control of food, environmental concerns. So those are usually number 2 and number 3 when I do my surveys. But there's, yes.
How it affects insects, bees,
Biodiversity,
etc.
Yeah, so I'm gonna lump that in with environmental concerns about genetically engineered foods and their impact on the environment. Yes.
A product that they had never been in there before, that could be like an issue. Like, I don't know, for me it would be weird having all these genes from different places, different organisms going into like corn or or strawberry or whatever you're putting those genes in.
Yeah, so that's usually the number one response, right? It seems weird to be mixing genes from these very, very different organisms, and people are often concerned about the impacts of that on human health, on the environment, corporate control of food. That's the suite of issues that I hear the most. There are other issues, of course. I'll take one of these, and then I'll let Natalie and Christina deal with the other ones if they want. But from a biologist's point of view, the thing about genes from different organisms being mixed together, I have to tell you that just does not raise a lot of eyebrows in biologists, right? So every cell in your body, every human cell, your human cells are outnumbered by far by bacterial cells in your body, by the way. But every human cell in your body is an amalgamation of two different organisms, and the mitochondria that are inside every one of your cells were once a free-living bacterium. And so if you sequenced human genome, you actually find all the genes that are in your nucleus that we usually think of as the human genome, and then you find this bacterial genome that's floating around in your mitochondria. I mean, does anybody think that's weird? In biology, one of the really cool discoveries in the last half of the 20th century is that the DNA evidence clearly tells us what Darwin predicted, and that is that all living things have a common ancestor, and therefore that's why when you take the gene from a bacterium and put it into a plant knows what to do with it, right? To the plant, the genetic code of a bacterium or a fungus or an animal, they all look the same. And so biologists are generally not that concerned about moving genes around between organisms, because when we look at the genes that they already have, they have so much in common. Now the differences do matter, and it's perfectly possible to do things that I think shouldn't be done by genetically engineered, at least not released out into the environment, genetically engineered. But the fact is, at our most fundamental level, we're a lot more alike than we are different with every organism on the planet. So it's really, really hard to get a biologist to get worked up about moving genes from one organism to another. I'll just give one more example of that. So in the 1980s, when I moved to Seattle to work on the very first genetically engineered plants that were being engineered using a bacterium, a soil bacterium, that as a part of its own life history injects its DNA into plant cells. And so the group at UW was working on how to get the bacterium to inject the DNA that we wanted injected instead of what the bacterium wanted injected. And as part of this, we were surveying plants from all over the world, and it turns out you can find wild tobaccos growing in South America, and when you look at their genome, they actually have remnants of these bacterial infections carried in their own chromosomes. So the idea that humans invented genetic engineering, I mean, that's just a pleasant fiction. I mean, organisms in nature exchange genes across incredibly wide evolutionary distances, often enough for it to be interesting. So for example, there are sea slugs that can do photosynthesis because they incorporate the chloroplast of the food that they eat into their own tissues, and sunlight can feed the sea slug. So the idea that only humans move DNA between widely different organisms is just not the case. It happens in nature all the time, and everybody in this room is a result of that process. So that's one concern. That's one reason I think that scientists typically worry much less about that, even though it's probably the most common concern expressed by the general public. That it just seems unnatural. Well, believe me, there are a lot of things that are natural that are bad for you, and I invite you to go eat plants at random, and you will quickly find out that there are lots of natural things that are bad for you. And there are also unnatural things that are good for you. I hope everyone gets vaccinated. I mean, there's nothing natural about a vaccination, but it actually improves human health, human well-being. So not everything that's natural is good for you, not everything that's unnatural is bad for you. And even though you may not know of a lot of examples of moving genes across wide distances in evolutionary time, if you looked at biology, across what we know about biology now, that is a pretty common thing, and humans have only recently figured out how to do it, but nature figured out how to do it a long time ago.
So either of you want to jump in there?
Well, I was going to move on to some of the others if that's okay. Toby
Yeah.
did a great job of getting people to say their questions that they
Yeah.
were willing to say. So let's try to get to that. I'll do my best. So the first one was, why maybe are people so afraid? And you got, these are some of the issues around it. But the way I kind of look at it, because I do talk to a lot of folks who have a lot of concerns, and I think that, first of all, I'm really glad that people care about their food and that people are paying attention to how food is grown and that they're interested in us doing a better job through agriculture. I think that's wonderful because very few people actually farm in the United States. It's really it's hard work, and most of us, many people have no idea where their food comes from. So I think it's a wonderful conversation. And in my experience, folks have some people who are very opposed to the technology or to different pieces of agriculture. Sometimes they have sort of a philosophical feeling about that, and I very much respect that. But for many people, I find there's just an enormous amount of misinformation, and they're confused, and they're trying to find answers to their questions. And there's some things that are really wonderful about the internet to be able to find information, but one of the challenges is that misinformation can move really quickly as well. And so that's why those couple of websites I mentioned to you as examples, our company needed to do, and I'd say our whole industry, but Monsanto really needed to do a better job, I think, sooner of trying to be recognizing these questions and providing people with information and in terms that were not so scientific and that they could really relate to. So, and we found that when we can have these conversations and answer people's questions, oftentimes I think they feel much more comfortable. And I think also as they start learning more about those global challenges we've talked about, and the fact that we do need a lot of tools in the box, and that the scientific community is really, that these are the most studied foods in the history of mankind and have been found to be, those on the market have been found to be safe by numerous scientific authorities around the world. It gives people, I think, a fair bit of comfort. So let's move on to lower yields of farmers. I think that was the other question the first gentleman
Could you go
asked.
back to corporate control of seeds?
Sure.
That was one of the first things that was mentioned.
Sure, and these are kind of related in a way. So I don't know what all we're thinking of with corporate control, but if it's the idea of we want farmers to have choices, as I mentioned earlier, to us that's really important. We really think it's important that there's diverse systems of agriculture out there. We think there's room and need for organic agriculture, conventional agriculture, genetic engineering, and there's more that we need to discover and develop together. So we're very open to that. We want farmers to have lots of choices and lots of different varieties and seed companies to choose from. So that's why I mentioned in that WEMA partnership, that business model, we specifically did that because we recognize that in these African countries, there aren't a lot of those seed companies today. There's very small African seed companies that are really trying to get off the ground. And it was important that they have access to this technology, not just Monsanto. And so, and the other thing we do here in the United States is that we license our technology. So Monsanto develops, we invest about $100 million to develop one of these genetically engineered traits, and it takes like 15 years. And we sell that seed. But there's a lot of other seed companies out there, hundreds of them even in the United States, some of which can't afford that kind of R&D. And so we have a licensing model where they can breed their own varieties, they can have their own customer service, their own kind of, their own business, but they can access these genetically engineered traits so that their products are going to be competitive in what the farmers really want, because that's what we see farmers demanding. So if you look at global seed supply around the world, Monsanto represents about 5%. Here in the United States, we have about a third of the market share in corn and a little less than that in soybeans. And there are other companies of various sizes that we compete very strongly with. I think the next thing, I'll go back to the yields. So you asked about, does it decrease yields for farmers? And I think that's I understand your question, but you probably, I don't know if you've spent a lot of time with farmers, or I'll put it this way. Most folks who I hear that question from haven't had the chance to talk very much with farmers. Farmers are really smart business people. They deal with enormous risk in their operation because it depends on Mother Nature and the weather. And so they are very, very careful in the kinds of decisions that they're making, and they will not make purchases, they will not make investments unless it's going to actually work for them. And that's definitely true here in the United States, and I've seen it to be just as true in a lot of developing countries where the farmers have their choice. You know, Larry said we could bring a slide, and I was tempted to bring this one slide, but I chose not to. There's this wonderful slide of Indian farmers that a reporter took from a helicopter up high. Huge queue of farmers. It wrapped around. It was just gigantic. And those were Indian farmers standing in line to access BT cotton, which is this insect-protected cotton. And there's about 90% of the farmers in India are using that technology right now. It's helped them to reduce their insecticide sprays from about 6 times a year to about twice a year. They've been able to double or sometimes even triple their incomes, and with that they've been able to get better maternal health care, send their kids to school, really wonderful things that have improved their lives. And you know, the Indian farmers themselves were so frustrated with this question and these sort of attacks that it really wasn't bringing them yield benefits, but they're still waiting in line to purchase the seed. That the Indian Farmer Association itself actually undertook a study, a socioeconomic study of what those seeds have done for those farmers and their families and their livelihoods, and it's publicly available. So it's the farmers themselves that paid for the study, because any study that was paid for by industry, people would try to say that couldn't be true. So they paid for one themselves. What do we have next here? Suing farmers? This is
Environment.
okay.
Tolerance of pesticides.
Okay, so why don't we,
Herbicide tolerance.
I'm going to address the cameraman's question, as long as we're kind of on that topic. So in the United States, I mentioned we invest about $100 million to develop one of these products. When the first product we developed in cotton, which is a self-replicating crop. So, you know, Toby mentioned hybrid seed, meaning farmers here know that they want to buy fresh seed every year for that hybrid vigor. But there's certain crops where they don't have that hybrid vigor, and cotton is one of those. So we invested all this money in developing this cotton seed that could resist pests. And we basically met with the cotton farmers and told them, so here's the deal, this is what we've invested. We want to keep investing in new technologies. And they said, yes, we want you to keep investing in new technologies. We're willing to pay for this because we want you to keep investing. We said, well, how are we going to do this? Because either we're going to have to recoup this investment in one time, you're going to buy this bag of seed and then you're just going to keep replanting it, or how do you want to do that? Because that would have been a lot of money for one bag of seed that's going to last them for however long. And so they wanted us to work on a contract that we would create together, a legal contract, written contract that basically said we will sell them the seed and they will plant it once and then they will come back and buy new seed for the next season. And that allows us to be able to recoup that investment year after year. But the thing they said is they wanted a level playing field. So they wanted to make sure that other farmers were honoring that same contract. So every year we sell to about 275,000 farmers in the US. And since 1997, we've sued about 148 farmers. These are very difficult decisions for us to make. Farmers are our customers. The last thing we want to do is to be entering into some sort of a dispute like that with them. But these were all cases where their neighbors actually wanted us to take action, and they were very egregiously breaking their contract. On those 148 cases, 12 actually went to a court, and in all cases, the court analysis cited that the farmer had broken their contract. Whenever we are in this situation, whatever penalties there are, we donate into that local community that the farmer lived in. Our intention here, we want to avoid these kind of situations at all costs, but we think that this is the best way we have right now for us to be able to continue to recoup investment and honor these agreements amongst all the farmers.
I think it's really valid concern to have, to be concerned about how your food gets made, who makes it, whose interests are represented in that. I think that's a really valid concern. I do think it's unfortunate that concern about corporate control and over food has been so paired with the discussion around the technology of genetic engineering and what the potential that technology has. I consider those to be really separate issues, because I think that even before genetic engineering as a technique was ever created, that was probably still a legitimate concern, because there are, seeds that are produced through just basic breeding that are sold by seed companies who own the rights to that. And that's, I think that those are very valid concerns. But I also see them as separate to the issue of genetic engineering as a tool, and I think it's a very powerful tool that has a very high potential to help a lot of people. And I think Natalie mentioned this at the beginning, but the vast majority of farmers that are growing genetically engineered crops are actually developing country farmers, and a lot of those are produced by public organizations. They're getting them for very much lower cost than they would get them here. And they do provide a benefit, and I think we've seen that. We've seen that in India. Burkina Faso is an example that comes to mind too, where farmers in Burkina Faso so wanted to be growing BT cotton that they were growing it before their government had a chance to create a regulatory system to regulate it. And so the government of Burkina Faso had to really just step up and develop a regulatory system so that they could formally approve BT cotton in that country, because the farmers wanted it so bad. So I think that that's another example of how, and the point of farmers being risk averse. I don't think that, it could not be more true than in a low income country, when it's not just the profit of your farm business, but it's really about feeding your children, and it's about, being able to send them to school, and the trade-offs that you're making when you're deciding what to plant and what seeds to buy are huge. There's a lot on the line for those farmers. So I would say that if there's a product that a new corn variety that can help those farmers, that will boost their yields and boost their productivity and allow them to send their kids to school and lift themselves out of poverty, the way that that's produced, as long as it goes through the proper regulatory mechanisms for each country, that's a win for those farmers.
Good. Other questions?
There was a question on bees.
Oh, there was a question on
Honeybees?
Yeah, herbicide tolerance, and let's see, I'm looking here. You looked at it under environment, but the question of honeybees being harmed by genetically modified.
Being harmed by the overuse of pesticides.
Oh, being harmed by the overuse of pesticides comes as a result of biotech seeds.
They manufacture the genetically modified seeds to withstand the herbicide.
Right.
So they use the herbicide.
So they use more of it because it's not going to harm the crop.
Because it won't harm the crop. And that has an effect on insects, bees.
Sure. Is that true? I don't know. In the case of cotton, it's not. But
So let me try to explain or address that one. So honeybees are one of the what we call non-target insects that is evaluated to ensure that there isn't going to be an impact on honeybees, and genetically engineered crops were not found to have an impact on honeybees. But I do think this is a really important issue of what's happening with honeybees. We actually purchased a small Israeli company a couple years ago, that was developing a biological control for a certain mite that was affecting honeybees. And we had to decide if we're going to continue. We bought it for completely different reasons. We wanted to use their technology process for agriculture products. And so what we did is we didn't know anything about honeybees. So we had a big honeybee summit, and we invited 100 of the foremost honeybee experts around the country to come to Monsanto, and let's talk about what's really affecting honeybees, and let's put it all out on the table. And it was a really very eye-opening kind of experience for many of us, and a really wonderful summit. We did talk about pesticide use in row crops. We talked about pesticide use in hives, because actually one of the biggest challenges of causing one of the contributors to colony collapse disorder, which is this concept where the whole colonies are dying, is a mite that it infects the bee, and essentially is there's nothing that they can figure out to control it. And so what you see are beekeepers are putting pesticides into the hives trying to control this mite. And then the last thing was the lack of nutrition sources, that we don't have as much prairie around, and that these bees really need high nutrition sources at particular times of the year. So it was a really interesting, we put it all out on the table, and what came out of that conference was a few things. One is that we started a coalition with President Clinton has something called the Clinton Global Initiative, where he brings different folks together that wouldn't normally come together to try to tackle big issues. And so we did one on honeybee health. So you've got lots of different kinds of stakeholders coming together, and for the first time, you have the farming community and the environmental honeybee community coming together. Ironically, honeybee keepers are very involved in agriculture. Agriculture is completely, extremely dependent on honeybees. But those two communities had not really been talking before. And so part of what's coming out of that is an effort to try to educate row crop growers, farmers, about how and when to spray pesticides that are going to be least impactful to honeybees, and also for the honeybee keepers to understand how to manage their hives and the pesticides that they use in their hives, which are different. But the biggest thing that came out of it was this real focus on nutrition sources that we can be planting together, wildflowers and things like that, around when honeybees are really working hard, like when they're helping to produce all of our almonds. And also more research on this varroa mite. So Monsanto has since hired one of the premier honeybee experts in the country, who used to be with the state of Florida, who's leading these efforts for us, and we have a honeybee health advisory council that we're seeking input from. And I actually think this work on the varroa mite, this whole summit, people were so excited that a company like Monsanto that invests in R&D like we do, was paying attention to the honeybees. So I like to tell this story because we all need to pay attention to the honeybees. It's really important. But I do think it's really excellent that those two communities came together and they had not before.
Can they use we have access to data through the internet so easily now. These beekeepers move their hives to where the crops are. Is there any attempt to try and coordinate the spraying of the crops with the prep?
This is exactly the kind of thing they're trying to figure out.
Yeah, good. Someone else has it. Oh, just hang on to it. Go ahead, keep going, Dave. I was just wondering where the microphone was, but no, that's okay. I'm sorry. Just repeat his question.
I have one other question.
Well, go ahead.
You say there's 2% of the people in the U.S. are farmers.
It's probably less
Something
than
like that.
And in Africa, what percent do you think are farmers?
Well, in some countries, like Malawi, 80% of the people are farmers.
Does this have to do with jobs? If they farm, or could farm as well as we do, where would people go? If it only took 2% of the population to produce enough food for their nation, and it's currently using 80% of the people to farm, where does 76% go? What do they do?
Well, I mean, I think the United States went through a similar transition, right? So, I mean, if you think about in the 1920s, 30s Dust Bowl era, that most of the farming in the United States was done on small family farms, and that's really shifted over time. So, I mean, I think that's just one example of how, as yields increase and it doesn't require the whole, all 5 to 10 children being out of school in the summer to help with the harvest. What our society has done, and it frees up those children's time to be in school, to get an education, and to
work for Monsanto.
I mean,
my view is we're running out of jobs, even in the U.S.
Well, many of the farmers, technically their job is farmer, but they're a subsistence farmer. They don't make money at it.
Yeah.
They're doing it for a living. And so if their yields were higher and they had excess crops that they could sell, then they would become part of the economy instead of just a subsistence farmer.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's the improvements in agricultural productivity that led to the specialization. I mean, agriculture in its invention 10,000 years ago is what led to the formation of the first cities and the civilization that we have now. And as Christina said, I mean, we've seen that play out in the developed world time after time, where fewer and fewer people farm because it takes fewer and fewer people to produce the food that we all need, and everyone else is free to specialize and carry out other economic activity that turns out to be quite valuable for the society as a whole. I wouldn't worry at all about what these people are going to do for a living. At least they'll have enough food for one thing for the first time, and they will create new economic engines if their time isn't spent doing manual labor in a farm field that prevents the children from getting an education.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's actually a really wonderful book called The Last Hunger Season that profiles several farmers in Kenya, smallholder farmers, women farmers, through a whole season. And it talks through, their participation with a group called the 1 Acre Fund. And it really you really get a sense of what the lives of these farmers are like. And the title of the book, The Last Hunger Season, refers to the annual hunger season for those farmers in Kenya. And that's a real thing. I mean, that's a period of anywhere from, a month to sometimes upwards of 6 months of real hunger, where they'll ratchet down from 3 meals a day to 2 to 1 to just tea. And so, I think that there's quite a bit of productivity on these farms that would just go to fill tummies, and before it ever even reached the money in pocket stage. There's plenty of room for growth, and we always talk about demand, and when we're talking at the foundation about markets and where's the demand and how how are these things moving. We talk about this as being sort of like a hidden market that really it's the on-farm consumption that it's so easy to forget about, but it's not, they'll produce more and then that'll just be a huge bumper crop that they'll have to figure out what to do with. They'll know exactly what to do with it.
Somebody's been waiting back here very patiently, but she has the microphone, so ask your question.
So how are these farmers getting access to the information you're talking about these seeds and the productability, and who is responsible for this knowledge?
Well, I mean, in developing countries, I think that's still a big constraint. It's a big constraint. A lot of these farmers are very, very rural, don't always have access to roads. There are some extension systems that sort of work. I've heard farmers refer to them more as sort of political outreach entities. But there's also a lot of groups that are doing some really nice work. There's a group called Digital Green that Foundation supports that's doing some really nice work in getting farmer organizations, farmer groups to, use videotapes to tape themselves recording themselves doing the exact kind of techniques that they've worked with the Digital Green family or group to work out, and kind of create a video that then gets shared between different farmer groups. So I think that there's a lot of innovative ways. People are looking to cell phones actually as a way to transmit some of this information and good agricultural information about where to buy seed, when to buy seed, and fertilizer, to best ways to plant. There's we fund a project called Farm Radio that uses radio to broadcast that information too, and that's something that exists in this country even today. You can dial into farm radio to get information. And in the United States, I think, the land grant institutions, which are these colleges all throughout the United States that are designated as land grant colleges, have been supported by the government to do agricultural research, and not just research, but extension too, which is going and talking to farmers. So you'll find scientists just like Toby that spend 50% of their time doing nothing but talk to farmers. And Washington State University actually has a very nice extension program, and even for the local gardener here in Seattle has wonderful information about how to keep your heirloom tomatoes pest-free and things like that. So for us, it's a lot easier. You have access to the internet. You can look things up like that. For farmers in developing countries and low-income countries, it's much harder. But I think that there are a lot of really good and very creative technical solutions to some of that problem that we're starting to really see. And yeah, cell phones are very powerful. It's amazing. The reach of cell phones is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, you can go to some of the most rural places in Africa and there will be a farmer with a cell phone.
Can I build on that just a little bit?
Absolutely do.
So just to build on where Christina was at, I think in India we've been able to use that a cell phone system like that to serve our farmers there. So what we're trying to do, to Christina's point, this extension service, people on the ground ask questions. In some of these countries, that's hard. It's hard for them to reach those farmers. So one of the things we've done in India is that when a farmer buys a product from us, there's a call center that they can call into, and they can share what information they want to about their farm. And what we find is many of them want to talk to us about, you know, the soil types, the kind of pest outbreaks they've been having, and we help give them information about what we think would be the best kind of seed for them to use. We can send them a text message to say, hey, insects are hatching here, you should be treating because you're probably going to have some come your way pretty soon. We can send them information about the market prices out there, because one of the things that can be hard for them is if they can't access what are the options for how they can best sell their grain or their cotton, they can't get the best price, so we try to share that with them. And every year now we're finding they're coming back. It's been great for us in terms of they're happy, they're getting better yields, they're using their water and everything more efficiently. So it's really paying for itself and it's working really well as a kind of system. What I'm really excited about though too is that we're reaching 3 million Indian households this way. And there's a lot of groups out there that work on better nutrition who have the same trouble that, you know, just like farmers can't access some of this kind of, you know, seed or information, they can't access medical care either or better nutritional information. So we're looking at ways that we can actually try to get them better nutrition information for their household as well.
Okay. We have time for one last question here.
Could one or multiple of you give us an update on the development and use of golden rice? When I first read about it, it seemed like a fantastic idea, the incorporating of beta-carotene into rice so that it boosts the vitamin A content in third world countries. And yet, to this day, I believe there's major conservation organizations condemning that product, I think mainly because it was produced through genetic engineering. Can you give us a kind of an update of where that product is? Is it actually being distributed, or is it still being held in experimental status, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, the Gates Foundation invests in golden rice. I'm not the program officer, so I don't have like the nitty gritty inside scoop, but I can tell you that, yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know what golden rice is, it's rice that has been engineered to contain a beta-carotene, which is the precursor for vitamin A. So you eat beta-carotene and then your body can help produce vitamin A. And vitamin A is very important because there are large numbers of people who are vitamin A deficient, and vitamin A deficiency can cause blindness and other really severe physical illness. I mean, people really, they can die from not lack of vitamin A. So it's a really important, you know, nutritional, really important nutrient and something that quite a few people in low-income countries don't have access to in their diet. So
the term golden comes
so the term golden rice comes from the color of the rice, because the gene that they took was from, I think it was from carrots, and so when they put it into the rice, rice goes from white to being slightly yellow or golden. So I call it golden rice. So huge potential to help a lot of people. And I believe the last that I heard was that they had to go back and do some scientific reworking of the product. So they had a product and it wasn't performing the way that they wanted it to. So it's now back in field trial stage, I believe. But the group is still definitely, you know, pushing forward and very committed to seeing that product eventually reach the people that it could really benefit from it. So we've certainly continued to invest in it because we believe that it has a very high potential to alleviate vitamin A deficiency and malnutrition in those populations.
What do you think the possibility is that the conservation organizations will back off on their criticism?
Oh, that's a very good question. Don't I wish I had a crystal ball for that one? Based on, so Toby always taught me that one of the best predictors of future behavior was past behavior. So I would say that I would guess that they probably are in for a very similar continued advocacy effort around that. I don't see Greenpeace suddenly saying, "Oh shucks, they're right," and packing up and just abandoning their efforts. That said, I do think that people, I would like to think, I'm hopeful that people are becoming a little bit more savvy to some of the misinformation that's out there, and that I do believe that people do want to really know what's real and what's true and have something real to hold on to. So I'm hopeful that as these products are developed, and I do think that those conservation organizations have been criticized for their efforts in that regard. So I'm hopeful that people will continue to seek the truth on these issues, and also really understand that the lives of people in poor countries are fundamentally different than the lives of people here, and that the challenges that they face in a day-to-day world are just on a different level. I mean, if you are vitamin A deficient, and you're suffering from those kinds of illnesses, it's really severe. And I can't imagine, I have a 2.5-year-old, and I cannot imagine watching my son go through something like that and not be able to do anything about it, because I just don't have the resources, and I can't go down to my corner store and buy a vitamin supplement. So if I'm a mom and those are my choices, I would be clamoring for golden rice.
Okay, I think we need to end it because it's past 8:30, but generates a lot more questions. I certainly would have some, but please join me in giving a round of applause to the three that came here. I think we've all enjoyed this very, very much. And I have a lot more questions. That's a measure of a good class or a good discussion. By the way, Toby, do you have children?
I do. I have
So we're fathers too, by the way. It's been mentioned a couple times about the mothers, but there are 2 fathers up here. But seriously, thank you very, very much for coming out. There's a program in your program. You can see upcoming GAC events being held in this room about the same time next Thursday. There's also a survey in your program. Give us a little bit of feedback, if you would, on what you like or what you didn't like, what you learned, and what you'd like to see more of in the future, and we will try our best to accommodate that. There are some students in the class. If they need a paper signed for classes, I'm the person to see, not these folks. So see me after we end here. And again, thank you all very much for coming, and please get home safe.